Good morning, everyone. My name is Tommy Boland. I'm the Associate Dean for Research, Innovation and Impact in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in University College Dublin. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this morning to the third of our research seminar in our research seminar series, focusing on the research activity taking place within the School of Agriculture and Food Science, and also focusing on the international collaborations we have with experts from right around the globe, addressing the important challenges facing our sector and facing society as a whole at the moment. We have a really exciting seminar in place for you this morning. I'm very much looking forward to our speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our chairperson, Dr. Mary Harty, who's a lecturer in horticulture within the School of Agriculture and Food Science. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Today's seminar focuses on plants, people, and our planet. Our world is facing a series of challenges, among them climate change, biodiversity loss, and the move from rural to urban living. This seminar will discuss the importance of plants and focus on how we can use and conserve them to build a new sustainable world with healthy people and a healthy planet. Before we start the seminar, I want to take the opportunity to show you a short 2-minute video compiled by our colleague, now retired Associate Professor Owen Doyle, about horticulture. So bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen.
Our world is facing immense challenges.
My apologies.
Our world is facing immense challenges. Climate change, mass migration from the countryside to megacities, food shortages, excess consumption, food waste, pollution, and freshwater shortages. With science, advanced technologies, innovation, and creativity, solutions can be found. Through sustainable cultivation of plants and an increase in plant-based diets, many of these challenges can be overcome. We have co-evolved with green plants over millennia. They provide the very oxygen we breathe, the food we eat, shelter, and medicines. They bring living color to our lives. Horticulture is science, technology, art, and business. It cultivates and uses plants to improve human life. Horticulturists and horticultural scientists create global solutions for safe, sustainable, nutritious food and healthy, restorative, and beautiful environments. Join this journey. Make your contribution. So open your mind, cultivate your imagination, and dream of a bright new future. All that's needed is the right career. Horticulture. Plants for people, plants for our planet.
So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So Professor Alistair Griffiths is the Director of Science and Collections at the Royal Horticultural Society. Alistair leads the RHS's highly skilled team of scientists focusing on assimilating, evaluating and sharing the most current scientific knowledge and undertaking scientific research to provide high quality evidence-based solutions to address horticultural challenges. Alistair is responsible for ensuring that the RHS charity remains at the forefront of horticultural science. Prior to the RHS, he was a key player in using horticultural science to create the award-winning Eden Project, spending a decade there as the head scientist. Alistair is also interested in how gardening and growing garden plants, both indoors and out, can help towards improving the well-being of people, and is a co-author of Your Wellbeing Garden, How to Make Your Garden Good for You, Science, Design and Practice. His ambition is to build a more resilient garden community who enjoy their gardens and who take positive action to benefit their gardening handprint on the planet and to maximise the health of our nation. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Alistair for the first talk.
Thanks very much. And I shall just share my screen. Okay, so can everyone see that? Is that okay? Great. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this really important area and how important the plants that are around us, which provide the air we breathe, to talk about what the opportunities are in relation to this. So if I start, there are this work here was from the World Economic Forum of Global Risk Perception. And what you can see is the more severe risks on global scale over the next 10 years. And certainly there's been a shift. So that number one issue is around climate action failure. So not taking action, the inaction of people to move around that. And then many of these other things that you're seeing is what we're currently facing at the moment. But there is hope, there is opportunity to help and turn around this. And in part of the solution is through delivering nature-based solutions. And, you know, the tie-in with the Sustainable Development Goals, the COP27 in November, and also the COP15 linked to biodiversity are really critical. Alongside, and if those of you haven't come across a guy called Dr. Johan Rockström, who designed the element of planetary boundaries, it's well worth watching his work with David Attenborough on Netflix called Breaking Boundaries, because it takes you through some of the scenarios we're in at the moment. What it's showing is that there's 9 planetary boundaries, and 2 of them we've already crossed over. One is around biodiversity and one is around the climate crisis. Now, to put this into context in relation to the realms of gardening and why gardeners can perhaps help in this, is just to show you that, you know, nearly almost 1 in 2 people in the UK actively garden. There are 700,000 hectares of domestic gardens. And then in cities, there is between 25 and 30%, so roughly 29.5% average of garden within that, both indoors and out. So a garden elements can also lead to a single plot plant. You don't need to own a garden. And then during COVID-19, 88% of households in Great Britain had access and used private or shared garden during that lockdown. Now, what not a lot of people recognize is that humans use more different types of cultivated ornamental plants than any other plant types in the world. They're surrounding our habitat. So with food plants, for example, there are 50,000 different types of plants, of which, you know, maybe 1,000 we use a lot of the time, and even less in relation to the amount that we use in, say, 60–70% of people for food. Medicine, 34,408. And the RHS Plant Finder shows that there's 81,000 ornamental plants. And the RHS scientists believe that there could be up to 400,000 different types of cultivated plants in our landscapes. So they're already within our landscapes. And then when you compare that with the native UK plant species, which are critically important as well, all plant species and diversity is important for resilience, there is roughly 1,500 different types of plants. So why is it that we surround ourselves with these cultivated plants, and what benefits do they provide us in relation to our aspects? Well, I'll talk a little bit more about that in relation to the work that I've done on health and well-being with a number of universities in collaboration. So just so that you're aware, this is based at Surrey in Wisley. This is the £35 million investment, and it's called RHS Hilltop Home of Gardening Science. And we want to put ourselves on the map in relation to a global scientific research institute that is focused predominantly on gardening science. And the nuts and bolts of what we want to do is three key areas. One is garden plant diversity. So looking at those things. We want to look at plant health. So we're looking at optimizing garden plant genetic diversity through the health aspects. We want to keep them healthy also through biosecurity. So theme 2, plant health, and theme 3 is about environmental horticulture. So minimizing resource use and waste while maximizing the plant environmental and health benefits. So in effect, what we want is science and collections working together to optimize garden plant diversity, to maximize their environmental and health benefits, whilst minimizing resource use and waste and publicizing their benefits. And we have about 122 scientists, and we have 16 PhDs and 5 postdocs, and we're working towards 30 PhDs in relation to this. The other thing we've recently launched, which is online, is this RHS sustainability strategy. And what we've done here is what actions can gardeners take, or the RHS can take, or industry and government can take. And we did some analyses. We worked with our president, who ironically has a very funny name. It's called Keith Weed. And Keith Weed used to work with Unilever and develop the sustainability strategy. And we also worked with Sue Gerard, who worked with Keith on the sustainability strategy. And we worked up with Tim Upson and others from the RHS, this sustainability strategy for the RHS. And it has 6 net positive for nature, and really important, because most people leave this element out, and it's the people that are going to take action, is for net positive for people. And each of these areas looks at different ways of what's termed as streams in relation to projects. So if you imagine you're sat in a stream, it's a bit wet, but downstream, you're looking at, perhaps there are things that whatever you have, maybe you drop something, it goes down and it impacts something downstream. Whereas upstream, it's things that might be coming from upstream that impact you, and how can you interact with that? So again, something might be floating towards you and you can move it, or you can take action to mitigate and adapt against those things. Now, the biggest thing that the RHS felt in all its operations, and yes, we will get, we'll look at get our operations intact, is that actually getting action from the 30 million gardeners across the country, across the country initially, and then maybe further, means that you can have a big impact. So if I give you some examples of the things that we're asking people to do. So, planting a tree. So in a domestic garden, so if everyone planted a medium-sized garden in their tree, in their home, in their schools, anywhere they were, and grew it to maturity, that would be equivalent to driving an electric car, carbon equivalence of 11.4 million times around the planet. Water the way nature intended. So we have a campaign which I'll talk about in a bit. Going peat free, making your own compost, pull up a paving slab, plants for pollinators, grow your own bunch of flowers. This was an interesting one we found, that if you grow your own bunch of flowers, or if you, we have something called flowers from the farm. If you do flowers from the farm, you can actually save per bunch of flowers 7.9 kilograms, as opposed to buying it from a supermarket. And therefore there's an industry opportunity growth for that. Electrify your garden, help map garden plant diversity, and eat more homegrown. So these are the things in our sustainability strategy that we're asking gardeners to take action on. Now, it's about the right plant for the right place for the right purpose. Be it native or non-native, as climate changes, we are going to end up with a mosaic of plant material. And in a vast majority of the plants that are in our world are actually cultivated but derived from wild origin, they will also play a significant role. What you've got here is a map showing the different types of elements that a tree can give, but also the different types of carbon storage, which is linked to a forest research project, in a lifetime linked to maturity. So you can then equate that as a nursery has done at Bartram's to give you calculations about what we should be planting over those time periods. That also needs to link into envelopes, so climate envelopes, to understand what tree genotypes or ecotypes do we need to plant that can do these things. So quite a bit of work. And, it's not rocket science that if you actually have vegetation and soil and trees, and we're doing a number of research projects on rain interception, on infiltration, that you can actually slow down that surface runoff and develop those aspects. So flood mitigation and where that plants can mitigate is a research area that's of real interest. Plants as pollution. So we've done some research that found that hairy leaves on Cotoneaster franchettii actually can capture 20 times more pollutant than Photinia. So, and these different plants have scales, have wax, can all do these different things. And designing for quiet. So we've got a PhD project currently looking at vegetation for acoustic panels. Rather than looking at build back better, we need to grow and build back better in a way that is sustainable with our habitats. So one of the things that is critical is looking at how we can look at overall, how do we provide the evidence and the action to reduce our gardening footprints while increasing our gardening handprints? And peat is one area that has a massive opportunity in relation to changing these alternatives. And we'll be announcing just the back end of this week about a big £1 million project that links to how we can help industry and gardeners transition to peat free. And we have agreed that we will have an agreement of 2025. Why is that? Because actually, in relation to peatlands, they are the only terrestrial habitat that can store carbon for thousands of years, for the longest period of time. So we need to get them back intact, and we need to look at these things. And there are alternatives now. And if you look at those alternative life cycle analyses, those life cycle analyses are nowhere near in relation to the power that we have a carbon storage mechanism for thousands of years. And so that overrides any types of nuances on the amounts of carbon that we're looking at saving by looking at alternatives. We also have My Garden. So currently My Garden is an RHS thing online that people can access, and anyone can access, members and non-members. We currently have 165,000 people on that. You put your plants in. We have an app that you take a picture, it identifies the plant and then puts it onto your list. And then we give you, for our advisory information that we give you tips on how to grow things. We have 3 million plants that have been put on that, and 87,000 different types of plants currently growing in those gardens. We also have got a plant selector, so we've got 33,000 different types of plants on there. One of the campaigns I talked about was the Mains to Rains water. So if you go Mains to Rains on a website, what we've done is we've given a number of bits of advice for people can do things. So far, we've had 34.77 million litres of water pledged by UK gardeners by taking action on the ground. We also have another example, which is RHS Plants for Pollinators. This logo is now throughout the whole of industry. And so gardeners are looking in garden magazines or in seed catalogues, will have these things. Plus our gardens, we're looking at doing biodiversity inventories linked to those. We are signing up to the Plant Healthy Certification Scheme in the UK, so we're going to get registered and acknowledged with that. And we're encouraging our providers to also follow those, which are a set of rules linked to that, which is, so the Plant Healthy Certification Scheme is a really good scheme for UK growers. Why does all this matter? Why do we need to worry about the climate and biodiversity? Isn't it just scientists ranting on that it isn't important? Well, the evidence base is there, and it's really critical that actually it's our habitat, and we are part of nature. And these mind, body and soul things that you're seeing here are all underpinned through evidence-based research on papers that have talked about the benefits from gardening and nature. And just to give you one example, 57% of us humans is not human, it's other organisms. We're actually only 43% human ourselves, and therefore what is happening in our human microbiome is really important. Now, this is a study that was done by Rosalind on intervention. What they did, basically, 3 gardens, 1, 2, 3, one without a garden soil, one in the forest school, one with the others.
Sorry to interrupt, Alistair. Could you put your screen on full screen? It's just, I can see the speaker view. I wonder if you can change it.
I think on display settings at the top. Yeah.
Swap presenter views.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yep.
Is that it?
Thank
Apologies
you.
for that. Apologies
No
for
worries.
that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Rosalind, basically 3 gardens. So 1 garden, no soil and garden, another school, woodland, another school. What they did is they measured the microbiome, they measured their skin, and they measured their gut flora. Surprise, surprise, the one without a garden had a very significantly different microbiome. And the microbiomes that the others had were good for immune system. What they did is they put a garden into that garden, and within a period of time, the microbiome changed for those kids. And they linked that microbiome to increased immune system. And therefore, you know, in relation to what we have with nature, it is really critical. So another study that we did with Exeter Peninsula Medical School, and we used the MENE, which is the Monitoring Environment, Natural Environment Survey. And we had quite a large data set. And what we found was those that gardening and use a garden had better health and well-being and activities. They met their physical activity guidelines. This paper was actually used as evidence to keep garden centres open in the UK and was successful amongst a whole bunch of other papers. Now, this is an example of a research project Lorraine Chalmin-Pugh did, and it was a study that we did with Sheffield University and the RHS, and we led Typical Street in Salford. What we did, small intervention, 2 containers and a tree, before and after shots. These are the trees in there. And what did we find? Well, we found a 6% decrease in perceived stress, equivalent to 8 weekly mindfulness sessions on the NHS. And we also found cortisol, which is a stress measure, 24% was the baseline, and it moved to 53% healthy curved people in relation to that. So significant physiological benefits linked to the fact that we are animals. Bridgewater, this was a pilot social prescribing thing, and I know that there's quite a bit of work that's happening out in your area, looking at with Natalie Bash, who's doing some really interesting work on social prescribing and using those links. But basically, you know, it saved me is some of those qualitative things that it's saying here by people that represent it. And then when you look at the stats before intervention, you can see low well-being, moderate well-being, and high well-being all shifting upwards in relation to a 9-week program that was GPs put across in relation to those. Another questionnaire linked with, again, Chalmin-Pugh, myself, and Sheffield University, looking at the 3 top reasons as to why gardens garden: pleasure and enjoyment, sensory reasons, health benefits. And we wanted to look at the dose response curves in relation to this. So if you look at the right-hand side, as never gardened, to the green side, which is daily, you can see that as we've shown in the Salford experiment, there's a decrease in the perceived stress score. Surprise, surprise, you can see an increase in the mental well-being score. And surprise, surprise, the more you garden, the more physical activity you do. Now, if people say, hang on a minute, this is just correlation. Well, you know, there is real hard evidence that physical exercise is directly causation. Increased physical exercise can cause better mental health, better people feeling better. So there's one of your key causations. Now, I looked across the world in relation to COVID-19, and what I found was that all across the world, people had found that actually gardening during lockdown had a significant beneficial impact on their mental health. In fact, if you look at the University College London study, 55,204 adults, what they found when they studied is that during lockdown, those that did 2.5 hours gardening or more had significantly better mental health, less anxiety. Surprise, surprise, those that watched 2.5 hours or more of news on COVID-19 had increased anxiety and depression. So what I want to say is that actually as humans, we're under some significant threats. If I was looking at us as a plant species and conservation biology, we have habitat destruction. We have stochastic weather extremes. We have endemics of disease. We have hunting in the form of warfare. We have all the prime things that are hitting us in relation to less resources, in relation to us becoming extinct. So we need to actively action how we create our new habitats. Because I would argue that nature is an essential human right and everyone should have a space to grow. And there's an example here around some of the key issues of having a city versus a green space. If you're in a green space, you have decreased heart rate, decreased respiration rate, dilated blood pressure, increased digestion, relaxed muscles, which then all leads to other good things. On the flip side, it's the negative reverse. So those that live in the city and have the pleasure of moving in the weekends to the countryside can rest and digest, but those that are stuck in there, it is not great. And this also has and makes economic sense. So in relation to the work that we've done with the Ornamental Horticulture Roundtable Group, we can show that by putting the green into green infrastructure, we can have 42 billion GDP, which is bigger than aerospace, increased jobs and increased tax potential. So both of these documents are online in relation to work that is necessary to do. And here's the book that was talking about the Your Wellbeing Garden. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you all enjoyed that.
Thank you, Alistair. That was a very interesting and informative presentation. I was particularly interested in the impact that the gardeners and horticulture has on nature-based solutions and in helping reduce biodiversity loss and helping to mitigate the climate crisis, as well as the research you're doing on the role of plants and gardening in improving human health. I'll give you a break now. So for anybody who has any questions, please add them to the Q&A button and we'll ask the questions at the end of the session. So I'd like to hand over now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Nolene Smith, who's my colleague here at the School of Agriculture and Food at UCD. Nolene is an assistant professor in horticulture with an environmental focus. She has a PhD and degree from Trinity and is a chartered horticulturist with diplomas from the RHS and National Botanic Gardens. Her research focus is on the links between current environmental issues and horticulture, cultivating a wider perspective for horticulture to meet current challenges. So over to you, Nolene.
Thank you very much, Mary, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm going to try and share my screen. Oh yeah, and I hope I put on the correct view here now. Oops. Screen sharing is paused. Okay, is that okay, Mary?
That's perfect, Nolene.
Okay, great. So thanks very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and online with Professor Alistair Griffiths as well from the RHS. And I think he totally outlined to us what plants do for us. So I'm going to take the other tack in what we can actually do for plants in return. So yeah, as Mary said, I've kind of trained in botany and horticulture, so I like to mingle in the kind of in-between spaces. So basically looking at environmental and conservation horticulture here in UCD. So anyway, I suppose, as Alistair said, yeah, we have this perception maybe of horticulture, and I think Alistair has pointed out to us some of maybe those perceptions are different. It's kind of seen as something maybe we do when we're older, and all the James Bond baddies had lots of plants, and then maybe it's down to, you know, somebody wanting to conquer and control nature. So those perceptions are kind of being challenged at the moment. And as pointed out earlier by Alistair, that all our life and all our air, food, medicine, clothing, shelter, clean water, all comes from plants. And I think shockingly for me, I think the statistics from the State of the World's Plant Reports in 2020 by the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew highlighted to us that 2 in 5 plants are basically facing extinction, which is really, really shocking. And by 2050, which isn't a million miles away, we could be losing tens and thousands more plant species. So I think this is my kind of call to action. And I suppose we're losing species really, even the ordinary ones, and before we even know their potential as food or medicine. So 2 of those 5 things could be the next kind of food or our next medicine. So even our humble cup of coffee is under threat by 2080. Again, more research by Kew showing us that wild Arabica coffee is facing near extinction. So these are very kind of sobering and very big facts for us. I think looking at crops as well, I think highlighting that basically half of us rely on just 3 crops, and there's so many more out there. I mean, there's definitely, as Alistair pointed out, there's way more crops and way more edible plants out there, but we're losing the ones that might be more adapted to our climate in the future, just as we speak. So I suppose one of the reports I was kind of involved with was Ireland's national report, the Convention on Biological Diversity a few years ago, sort of reporting on how well we're doing on our biodiversity here in Ireland. And I love this survey that was done as part of this report on page 120. You can download this PDF. And there was lots of questions just to general audience, like, have you ever heard of biodiversity? How informed do you feel about it? So I suppose 2 questions that really kind of stood out to me was, how informed do you feel about the loss of biodiversity? And you can see here that people didn't really feel informed about it at all just in 2019. And I'm very heartened to see the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss happening here in Ireland. And I know Professor Helen Sheridan from UCD talked about the role of agriculture and biodiversity at this Citizens' Assembly over the weekend. So we're going a little bit to try and inform people about the importance of biodiversity. And then the other side, the question that really kind of jumped out at me was, do you think the decline and possible extinction of animal and plants will have an impact on you personally? And people didn't really know. I mean, half and half there. Some said yes, some said no. So people, I suppose, don't understand the term, and we don't really understand what might happen if things get lost. So I suppose the kind of analogy that really works for me is like the rivet hypothesis. So basically, if you think of every species on the planet as like a little rivet on the airplane here, so we can lose lots of rivets. So here's our this was by a Stanford ecologist. So all the little rivets are basically species. So the airplane can stay in the air. We can lose a few rivets. It's not the end of the world, but basically, which one is the rivet that will sorry, I'm rushing ahead here. Which one is the rivet that will basically cause the wing to fall off the plane or the plane to fall from the sky? So basically, our world is like this ecosystem made up of lots of tiny species. Some of them are small, some of them are bigger, and we don't really know the importance of each one. So I suppose I like to think of each species in the same way. So I suppose, where did this journey kind of begin? And I kind of think, well, you know, as horticulturists, we grow things, you know, it's our natural instinct to want to cultivate and grow. And I suppose kind of feeling that species don't actually have to go extinct, and we can actually use horticulture basically to grow a lot of species. And I done a talk very many years ago on the planet as a garden patch. And I think it's kind of becoming increasingly more relevant in these days. So basically, this is where my kind of journey began, on a forest restoration project in the south, in one of the world's most remote islands down in Pitcairn Island, the South Central Pacific. And here an invasive species was basically pushing out a lot of the native species, and the native species were just basically being pushed off the island. So here was the team. We started to grow a lot of the native species, and a lot of cultivation for a knowledge about how to grow many of the world's species is really not known today. So this is a very grainy picture from a very long time ago. And in front of us there, we were growing miro trees, which basically the islanders were used for carvings to sell onto cruise ships. So all our plants are linked to people, and people are linked to plants in every way. So it's not just the sustainability for the plants, but sustainability for the people on these small islands. So here's just the plant highlights some of the research reports coming out of that. And it was work I carried out with Trinity College Dublin and the Irish Research Council. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about one of the plants that kind of popped up. It's this little yellow plant here. So this is our Butylon pitcairnense. So it's one species, one of those little rivets on the airplane ring, and it grows. It's an endemic species, so only found on this tiny little island in the South Pacific, and it hadn't been seen in very many years, I think over 80 years. And then in 2003, we found one growing in the wild. An islander took us to see it, and she had taken 2 cuttings of that particular plant. And I suppose it just highlighted to me the importance of horticulture and just this intervention, because stochastic threats can happen happen, random threats can happen. So in this case, we found it, and then 2 years later, a landslide destroyed that plant. That was the last one kind of that species growing in the wild. So luckily we had grown it on Pitcairn Island. We brought some cuttings back to Ireland and some seedlings back to Ireland to Trinity College Botanic Gardens, then brought some to the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. And then in Dublin, it flowered in cultivation for the very first time. And this was the very first technical description. We could actually use the plants we had grown in cultivation to publish this species, then to kind of get all the artists to do all the detailed drawings on its characteristics and everything. So just showed the important role of horticulture here in basically saving that particular species from going extinct. So saving that little rivet. So now we've hundreds of plants growing at the National Botanic Gardens in Dublin, but also in Kew and also in Missouri Botanic Gardens in the US. So this little rivet could have basically disappeared without anybody noticing, but now we actually have protected it in the Botanic Gardens in the world. So that's the importance of cultivating plants and the importance in basically saving species. So coming back to Ireland then, we actually declared, and we're one of the few countries to declare a biodiversity and climate emergency in 2019. So how are our own plants actually doing here? So how much of an emergency are we in? And this is one of the red lists produced by National Parks and Wildlife. And this is, you can see on the cover here. So these are our flowering plants that are rare. Of course, our non-flowering plants are a whole other story, and there's lots of rarity there as well. But this is the situation for Irish flowering plant species. So you can kind of see we've about 1,200 native plants. So these are the ones that are Irish, and about 100 of these have some sort of a threat characteristic. They've some sort of been assessed as being red listed or somewhat in danger. So 20 of these are actually critically endangered. So this is the kind of emergency room. This is the critically endangered. So we've 20 things that are critically endangered, like basically just sitting on our own doorsteps here in Ireland. So there's more endangered and lots vulnerable. And that's another report downloadable from National Parks and Wildlife. So we need horticulture, I would advocate, now more than ever, and we need it for new reasons. So we need it basically to produce crops in environmental and sustainable ways, basically to feed ourselves. But also we need horticulture for these other things that maybe we mightn't have linked horticulture to in the past. So we need it for rare species conservation, and we need to be out there weeding the wild. There's plants at the other end of the extreme that have become extremely weedy, and these are invasive species, and they're pushing out a lot of native species. And we also need to kind of develop basically sustainable consumption in lots of our useful species as well going forward. And I kind of highlighted that the issue with coffee. So we need to be able to grow these things and cultivate them sustainably. So if we look at climate change as obviously one of the big, kind of drivers of biodiversity loss, and I suppose the plants, in a sense, they don't have legs. They have to stay in the same place. So basically with sea level rising, and if you're at the top of a mountain and it's heating up, well, you've nowhere to run. Plants don't actually have legs, although you do kind of see a few with legs on the internet, which is always great for things like that. But anyway, back to our critically endangered plant species. So there's 20 of them. So these are species that have less than 50 individuals in Ireland. So this is a really tiny little amount of species. You're really kind of at the bottom here. So two of them, I'm just going to pick one from the sea and one from the summit. Sorry, my very excitable thing going on here. So basically I'll move on. So our seaside plant basically, so we've 20 of these critically endangered. So one of them on the seaside is this Achillea marittima, this little cottonweed, which basically grows right down at the bottom part of County Wexford. And then if we go to one up in the mountains, so this is one from the summit, this is a little Rubus chamois, which basically grows in one little dot there in Ireland. So you can see how rare these populations are, just one population there in each of these two locations. So these one growing right at the coast, basically going to be impacted by any sea level rise, and one growing right at the top of a mountain, which might be impacted by climate change. So this is Achillea marittima, or cottonweed, and it's very far from weedy. And I think the wonderful thing about plants is, with rare animals and with tigers, I always say you can't take a cutting from a tiger, but plants have this amazing ability. They retain that basically any cell can become a new cell, or they retain this ability to kind of reproduce from fragments and from seeds and stuff like that. So this is one of these rare plants. And this in the situation in 2018, in that there was only 13 plants left in the wild in September 2018. 2018, which was really quite shocking. And at the time, so there's a great ability of plants to be able to reproduce from fragments. We've been monitoring that population since 2018. And what's really kind of shocking is that of these 13 plants that remained, like they're just going extinct every year. One is dropping off, another year, two is dropping off, and we're losing like the biggest plant, and we're also losing the smallest plant. So it's totally random. We don't know why these species are just these numbers, just individuals, actually not even the species. So the species just decreasing where it is in the wild, just like very, very slowly and dropping off. So what can we do about this? So we can actually take the cuttings. So these are plants grown by National Botanic Gardens and by National Parks and Wildlife. And here National Parks and Wildlife opened a new area, and there's a whole paper on the history and development of this new area for cultivation just recently published in the BSBI. So you can look up that paper. So here is the new plot with lots of new plant species planted into it and cultivated. And what was wonderful about this is you kind of say, well, God, are we down to the last legs? The thing is just dipping out. It's not going to grow in the local place. But the wonderful thing that happened in 2021, which is basically this time last year, was that we seen the plants that we had put in 2018, 2019, 2020 actually having babies in situ. So this is the first time regeneration happened since the 1980s for this particular species. So this is a huge kind of result, and a great result as well. So we've gone from kind of very worryingly low numbers to now the plant is reproducing in the wild here again. And ex-staff from National Botanic Gardens and National Parks and Wildlife went down to count all the seedlings last week. There was over 500 little seedlings here down in County Wexford. So we know what to do. We can actually, learn lessons. We can grow things, and we can do so much more. So we can actually step in and save species from extinction. We don't have to be bystanders in this extinction crisis. So, and again, training the next generation is what we're all about here in UCD. So this was a final year student thesis. So obviously there's so few plants in the wild, and you have to get a special license if you want to take material for experiment or for cuttings. And this is a project by one of our final year students, Chen. And one of the things we wanted to find out was how much kind of cutting material, could you go with really small cuttings, or did you need really long cuttings with nodes and stuff like that? So one of the wonderful things was that we actually seen that, you can get very small cuttings, 1 to 2 centimeters, 2 to 5 centimeters to actually grow. So we don't need huge amounts of material to actually grow this species, to grow clones of this species. So that was really good. So training the next generation, I think, is very, very important. And you can see, so, and again, also communicating good news stories, because I think a lot of school children are quite depressed about the state of the planet. And and people are quite worried about biodiversity loss now, but they feel a bit paralyzed. So I think telling them the good news stories just in popular articles and on TV, this is very important for people to tell people that we can actually step in and we can do something positive for nature and for the environment and for our biodiversity here in Ireland. So these were just 2 pieces of publicity around this project. So moving up to the top of Ireland now to our other little dot, this little rubus that lives on a mountain up in County Tyrone. And so I've done another talk on this for the BSBI last year, the year before. So if you're really interested in rubus, you can go off and look at that particular talk. So as I said, there's one little population sitting up in the north of Ireland, and this is the finger of Ian McNeill, who is a county recorder. So, and who kind of knew where this rubus was growing, which this population was growing, because to be honest, if you set out with a backpack to try and find this particular rubus, talk about a needle in a haystack, it's extremely difficult to find unless we had the guiding hand or the guiding finger here of Ian McNeill leading the way. So the importance of kind of local knowledge as well on our species. So he's pointing basically where this little population of cloudberry grows in Northern Ireland. And you can see here, it's very bizarre. There's this little outlier population in Ireland, and you can see it's really widespread in Scotland and Northern England. And why we have this that's funny little dot in the north of Ireland and no more populations is quite bizarre and quite unusual. So anyway, at the time we applied to DAERA in Northern Ireland to get a license, because obviously this particular thing is extremely rare as well. So we got a license from DAERA in Northern Ireland, and this is Abigail Maiden who works with DAERA, and she came out and she helped us secure a little piece of rhizome from the plant just last July in 2021. So this was our like little more modern version of a Wardian case, which was like the 1.5 litre kind of ex-water bottle, but it makes a nice little rhizome transplanter here, exactly, and bringing it back. So this one is a little harder sell. Cottonweed is a nice fluffy thing, is a nice yellow flower in the winter. Cloudberry just looks like a piece of rooted and some peaty sludge here. So it's a bit of a harder sell for people why we want to save this. So bizarrely, this population might be a hardy outlier. It's been in this particular site, and we know this from herbarium records, for the last 196 years. Pretty amazing and pretty long-lived, definitely. And we monitored the population fully. So it was the first time we actually measured each individual in the population, measured all the leaves, counted each one, and that happened in July 2021. And we just missed a flower. So tantalizingly finding flowers, there was only one flower ever recorded on this, so this is another kind of bizarre. So we just missed that flower in 2021, so it's on the list for next year to go find this. So this was the first flower seen in over 100 years on this particular plant as well. And as I said, yeah, this might be a little bit of a harder sell as the rivet on the airplane. This one maybe, many people mightn't think is so important. But anyway, at the National Botanic Gardens, which grow lots of rare plants, the cloudberry actually made it through its first winter in cultivation. You can see it popping up there in April last year, which was a bit of a sigh of relief. So you can kind of see it sprouted again from the little rhizome piece. So now we now have this piece. So, even if there's a landslide up in County Tyrone, if there's a peat hag, if there's a bit of a bog burst there in the winter, we actually have this plant in cultivation. So we have a little piece of it, which is so important. But we can actually now experiment. We can develop methods of propagation to ensure this species doesn't go extinct. We don't even know if it's a boy or a girl, and we don't know if the population is a clone. So these are all questions that we can kind of answer through kind of horticultural techniques. We can build up enough material to actually do the molecular work on this, and we can kind of do so much more with these tiny pieces of material of these rare species. So recently, and to move on then to kind of talk about, so there are like our super rare, so critically endangered, one little populations, 19 individuals, 9 individuals. So species on the edge here in Ireland, so our critically endangered ones. So there's other drivers of biodiversity loss, and this was a report by IPBES in 2019. So we've kind of seen that climate change is one of our big drivers of biodiversity loss. But as I said, weedy species or invasive alien species are another driver of biodiversity loss, just like that little island in the South Pacific where there was an invasive tree species pushing out native forests. There's lots of invasive alien species here in Ireland as well. And also direct exploitation, as in our cup of coffee. There's so many more of us drinking wild Arabica coffee. We're actually pushing this species towards the brink of extinction. So Dublin, as the move from kind of rural areas to city areas, and the move to cities, so any kind of nature or any biodiversity at the fringes or the edges of our cities is becoming increasingly under threat. And this was some work we carried out in Howth, which is a beautiful kind of part of Dublin. This amazing, and you can do the cliff walk in Howth, which is fabulous, but it's a special area of conservation for heath and vegetated sea cliffs. So it's a really kind of important Irish habitat and recognised under EU law as well. So in this special area of conservation, we found 35 garden plants, which was quite shocking. And one of those plants there growing was a little South African plant, Carpobrotus edulis. Now it looks pretty innocent there, and it looks very nice and very pretty, but it's a bit of a tug. So it actually pushed out a lot of native species on the Lizard Peninsula and Cornwall. So the UK tend to get a lot of indications as to, you know, which species they tend to go a little bit nuts, maybe more in the UK, and they tend to go a little bit nuts later here in Ireland. So this is one that's actually sitting in this little special area of conservation in Howth in County Dublin. And we've been kind of working on eradicating that over a good few years. And there's still, it's like weeding every patch. The minute you turn your back, they pop right back up again. So there's still lots of little patches of Carpobrotus edulis out in Howth. But we found 35 or 34 other different gardens, plant species. And some of them are like Crassula helmsii, also regulated under the EU law, Japanese knotweed. But then there's other innocents. And I think out in Howth, one plant that's really settling in is one from the Canary Islands, Echium pininiana. And it's a spectacular plant and stunning. But I say, if you're in Howth and you're growing it in your garden, don't let it seed and don't let it kind of out of your garden. So like I was saying, with the plants don't have legs. So where did all these actual plants come from, and how did all these garden plants get into the special area of conservation? Like, were they planted in there? How did they get down there? They didn't walk down there. So one of the things we found on that particular road was that a lot of people were actually dumping their garden waste into this special area of conservation. So we don't actually value kind of wilder places around the fringes of our urban areas. And these are places that kind of house maybe some of our most important local biodiversity and you can see here the Echium pininiana just on the top fringe there. You can see some Hebes from New Zealand. You can see some Buddleias from Asia. And this is all some cordyline pieces as well. So this is just people and not valuing the nature on their doorstep. And this habitat is extremely kind of rare in Ireland. You know, it's wonderful, and also it's protected at the EU level. And this is what we're doing. We're actually dumping in. So basically, a lot of these were regenerating from fragments and clippings. And yeah, they're not traveling. And many people say, oh, invasive species, it's natural. It's kind of climate change. They'll find their own way. But these are not traveling on their own. These are actually being dumped in by people. And I think, yeah, definitely more responsible kind of horticulture and gardening, and definitely on the fringes of kind of our urban areas. So I suppose I'm getting near the end here now. So I'm going to say, and this is nearly where the music stops. And literally, this is kind of what's happening at the moment. So another thing around direct exploitation of plants is one of these trees growing in Brazil, an endemic species to Brazil, basically makes the bows for stringed musical instruments. So you can see here, the bow on this viola is made from this particular tree, Pau brasilia, and it's grown in this Atlantic rainforest in Brazil. And over the last 10 years, this particular habitat has been totally decimated. So Brazil, because it's a Brazilian species, they want to really protect this. So they don't want any more trade. They don't want timber going out of the country to make bows, because the species is pretty much close to extinction. And they want to list it on this. So we've heard of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and this is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So Pau brasilia is an endangered species, and we have been trading in it for a long time. It's been on a watch list, exports, imports, but small amounts of timber weren't covered on under the regulation. So small amounts of timber going out to make bows, you kind of go, well, it's not really going to cause too much of an issue. But if you've actually millions of bows being made out of a tree species, well, then it does become an issue. So Brazil want to uplist this species onto Appendix 1 in CITES, which is the one that affords most protection. So you can't trade in it at all. You're only allowed trade for conservation purposes only. But millions of instruments, the bows, are actually made from this particular tree, Pau brasilia. And you know, the music industry are very worried about this uplisting, and they're putting lots of money into funding plantations and looking to artificial propagation of the species to take the pressure off the wild population. So there's loads more species. This is not just one. So this is in a few weeks' time, I'm lucky enough to be heading off to this thing, which is basically the 19th World Wildlife Conference, the CITES conference, which will look at trade in endangered species. And there's hundreds more basically rare species and animals that the world are looking to regulate on this particular convention in a few years' time. So this is happening, and you'll be able to watch it online. So it's the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, and it's coming up in Panama in a few weeks' time. And as I said, I'm lucky enough to be able to travel as part of the Irish delegation funded by National Parks and Wildlife to partake and to make sure that Ireland is at the centre of these discussions about international trade and endangered species, and that we join with our colleagues in the EU in putting our voices forward in supporting as much conservation and to ensure sustainable trade into the future. So anyway, I'm getting near the end, and so I want to thank Mary for all her hard work in sharing here today. And Mary does a lot of interesting research on environmental sustainability, growing agricultural crops. And I suppose here at UCD, we want to look to horticulture to kind of cultivate the future. So Caroline as well, who is contact detail, our head of horticulture, she looks at apples, microgreens, horticultural therapy, and Tony, our voice on that wonderful video. And I think you'll all get a copy of the video. So Tony works on plants, pests and diseases here in UCD. So thanks for listening today, and it's a great pleasure to be online with you all. So thanks a million.
Thanks, Nolene. Really excellent presentation, highlighting what plants do for us and what we urgently need to do for plants to conserve them. I was shocked to see that a plant with the impact of the coffee plant is under threat. If the crisis is hitting such a well-known crop plant, then lesser known plants must be under severe threat. So at this stage, I'd like to ask Alistair and Nolene to both switch on their cameras and rejoin us. Thank you very much to the audience members for submitting your questions. I'd like to encourage you to continue to submit your questions to the Q&A. We're scheduled to finish at 12, but we'll probably run on for a few minutes to deal with all the questions. Okay, so the first question goes to Alistair. So the use of peat in horticulture and the impact on the planet is a huge issue. How hopeful are you that the 2025 deadline to go peat free in the horticulture industry will be met?
So the 2025 is what the RHS is looking at doing. I'm remaining hopeful and just going to continue to do action rather than inaction. I was in 4 or 5 meetings last week with government and with industry, and I think there's quite some critical time frames around the points of what the date. So I think the horticultural industry knows that it needs to happen. They're just looking at the time frames of when it should happen. And there are differing perspectives. Obviously, there's 2028, which is the one that is linked to the professional industry. And there are some that are talking about 2035 to 2040, which from an industry perspective. And then I also sit on the NGO group. And of course, the NGO group is saying tomorrow. And we need to be sensible and sustainable and look to the science about how we transition successfully. So I have to remain very hopeful that we will meet that target, and we'll do everything we possibly can to do that, even if decisions are made in government that contradict what we're doing. We'll just keep pushing forward. Okay,
thank you for that. Next question is one for you, Nolene. So one of the negative aspects of gardens is that they can be a source of invasive species. So how do you propose to deal with this?
So I suppose there's been lots of risk assessment done by the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and there's been lots of risk assessments at the European level. And I suppose sometimes at the European level, species that might be invasive in Europe, have no relation to what might be super invasive in Ireland. I think I give as an example the Gunnera tinctoria down in the west of Ireland. Like I remember after driving back from fields of it in the west of Ireland to talk on how to grow it. On the East Coast. So it's kind of bizarre that things can be quite localized. So I'd say to people, if there is plants in your gardens that are becoming a little invasive, make sure, don't let them siege. You can enjoy them. The polluter pays. I think that's what I would like to see happen. And if you let something escape from your garden, it's perfectly fine within your garden. But if you let it outside your garden, then you are responsible, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I think back to, actually, this is a kind of a question for Alistair again. It's really exciting to see the link between gardening and the human microbiome, and the link then back to the human immune system. How widely understood do you think that the impact that gardens have on human health is within the medical profession and more widely?
So I think it's getting better. I think in relation to the mental health, we had the RHS had a health and horticultural conference, which is online. You can if you type in RHS Health and Horticultural Conference, all the talks are there. I think There is certainly from a mental health perspective. So in the NHS, the chief lead of the NHS from mental health, Tim, has acknowledged that gardening is good for mental health. The RHS is also working with Lewisham Hospital. So we have a garden with Lewisham Hospital. But I think we just have to keep presenting that. I think in relation to knowledge on microbiome itself and the interventions, I think there's quite a bit more work to do, but I think that it is becoming clearer over time around those aspects. So I think perhaps the physical health element, but I think where certainly RHS is looking at from a study perspective is 3 areas: how much green space, what types of green space, and what's the interaction within those that can help with different aspects. So I think people are far more knowledgeable in certainly in England. I'm not sure about Ireland, and certainly in Scotland, but we still just got to keep telling people this evidence base is there and it's getting stronger.
Very good. Yeah. I think this question is really for both of you. So as our human species is facing extinction, how can we change the popular focus of saving the planet to saving our human species? So
Alistair, far away there, yeah. It's
a brave new world, and it is challenging to get people. I mean, I guess I've been in conservation since the age of 4. I actually managed to get a development moved to one side to serve the little ring plover with my mum and dad's help. Mum and dad aren't conservationists. I bullied them into it. Yeah. And I think what we have to do, although, is have a sensible voice around what we're doing here. So, you know, the tactics I used at 4, I would not use now, and we need to have evidence base, a calm voice about what we're doing it, but we also need to tap into some of the sort of behavioral change science work and the social science work in understanding how we can make this change, because without getting people to, humans in health, what they'll do is they'll either freeze and do nothing, which is some of the things that are happening. Form, which is curl up into a ball. Friend, those that are doing perhaps the wrong things. Or flight, they'll move. Well, there's nowhere to fly, except some people are looking at other planets. So there is an element of flight on our species. So I think what we have to do is provide solutions as well. So these are things you can directly do, and that actually one little thing that you can do, like even putting a tray under a plant pot can save 10 litres of water on your balcony, also gives us a bit of hope that we're doing something that can help. So I think it's all about not the stick, but more the sort of, these are the things we can do. Come on and get that momentum. We've done it with ozone stuff before. There are many cases where we've done. I think we just have to try and get behind that momentum, and the economic pullback is where the steps start coming back. So I think the other thing is that we seriously need to really take serious Das Gupta's review on the economic report of how a new economy should arise, and there are opportunities with a different way of thinking about our resources.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. Nolene, to you.
Yeah, I suppose I think Alistair kind of touched on it, that we don't actually value the services we get from nature. And I suppose definitely around that report, that we actually have to truly value what a species is kind of worth to us, or what an ecosystem is worth to us in terms of clean water and clean air and things like that. And yeah, so I think valuing nature, yeah, like there's natural capital, I think valuing our nature. And yeah, so, and I know in Ireland there's Natural Capital Ireland, and they're a good group to join up to for free, and you'll find out lots of information on kind of valuing nature in Ireland and how we're just starting to do this, yeah.
Okay, I'll stick with you, Nolene. So question from the audience: if we find a rare plant, from an ethics point of view, should we take a cutting? This audience member says that she adores plants, but sadly most of her cuttings don't survive long term, but she may be responsible for that herself. So what do you think?
Well, I suppose most of our rare plants that are on those lists are on some sort of Irish statutory protection, so you can't actually touch them without a license. Yeah, so I would say if you find a rare plant, report it to the National Biodiversity Data Centre or National Parks and Wildlife, and then they'll kind of arrange a survey and maybe look to what things could be done. Like that plant down in Wexford, we couldn't have touched it, you know, and we were really linking in with National Parks and Wildlife on their efforts to kind of restore that particular species and habitat, just providing, yeah, the kind of plants, you know, and the growing, yeah, that particular plant. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, if it's really rare, just maybe contact someone and try and, yeah, and then, you know, and set the wheels in motion then. Yeah,
very good. And what's the next priority species for conserving here in Ireland to save from extinction?
All of them. Yeah. So I mean, you can build lists of priority species, I suppose. Yeah, definitely ones under threat from climate change, invasive species. I think the best report kind of gave us the direction to focus our efforts on those that are kind of maybe the climate change, the ones that we use. I think very important, like the coffee, like the one that makes the bows for our fiddles. You know, like, you know, those ones. I think they're definitely a priority for people. Yeah.
Alistair, I'll send the last question your direction. So how hopeful are you, considering the rate that climate change is now happening, that the actions that we're taking as gardeners can make a significant difference?
I'm really hopeful, and I'm hopeful because in my career so far, what you don't hear about is all the positive things that are happening in the world in relation to changing. And I think, you know, there is strong evidence that if people connect with nature, they fall more in love with it. And actually, there's an element of this aspect of, even though these are small changes, those changes may then also spill over into their houses. So things like solar panels, things like air units and stuff. And actually, the calculations in relation to the handprint aspect is much bigger in relation to what you can do outside or even within your home in relation to those things. And, you know, so for example, if we had we know from the RHS that we know people aren't still composting. We know that if half of the people that aren't composting did compost, we know that they would divert 500 cubic metric tons of peat free, and that peat free could go directly into helping with regards to that transition to peat free. Again, you know, that water thing, you know, they're not a huge number, but as you get more and more people storing, water is really interesting. It's a bit like now how you store energy in batteries. The water tank is a battery, basically. So the more that we can get, if you've got space to store that water in the water tank, again, you will end up with millions, and it makes gardeners more resilient, so that the plants that they have in their gardens and the mosaics that are going to happen in the next, you know, by 2030, I think we're looking at a Madrid kind of climate for us. Even with that, even with changes, we're going to be looking at some of those, even with things that we do. So again, in relation to water and having those things, we got to make people resilient so that the landscapes that we have are able to provide those services and select plants that can do that. So again, the selection, that mosaic of plants that we're going to select going forward are critical. And just to mention on the invasive plant thing, there's only 0.009% of these plants that are invasive out of the 400,000. But it is really critical that we do keep them out of the wild, and that we do rigorous, as Nolene said, you know, evaluate these things. So when we're choosing the future floras in cultivated aspects, we need to tick, you know, has it got pest and disease issues? Has it got issues with invasibility? What is its characters that will do that? And then exclude those from what we're looking for in relation to plants for purpose for our future right plant, right place, right purpose. So I think I am really hopeful, and you know, I'm going to continue to be hopeful, because hope is a good thing to have, and I think every individual can make a difference.
Good stuff. Okay, thank you very much, I think we'll draw the session to the close. I'd like to thank both our speakers, Professor Alistair Griffiths from the Royal Horticultural Society and Dr. Nolene Smith from the School of Agriculture and Food Science here at UCD for 2 excellent presentations and for really engaging with the questions and giving very detailed answers. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for their engagement and for staying on almost all right to the end. Again, asking questions and I suppose contributing to what was a very interesting and informative session. I'd like to thank Patricia as well for managing the sessions, and she will provide a recording of the session to all of the attendees in the coming days. So again, thanks very much for attending and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah.
Thank you.
Alistair.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
See you.